A population is a group of individuals of a single species that live in the same general area. Members of a population rely on the same resources, the same environmental factors impact them, and they're likely to interact and breed with one another. It may be described by their boundaries or by their size or whatever, but really you're looking at the population as a changing system. Okay, births are going to add to the population, immigration is going to add to the population, deaths are going to remove, as well emigration, leaving the population. Okay, I always remember that I-N-E exits. But overall, the population size is going to be equal to the starting population plus births minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. Sometimes the immigration will be ignored. Okay, but when you're looking at these things, other factors are going to play a role as well, like natality, which is birth rate, mortality, which is death rate, okay, is going to be part of those structures. Um, Other factors of a population are going to be its density and its dispersion. Population density is going to be the number of organisms per unit area or volume, so that's pretty straightforward. Dispersion is more a matter of spread. Are they clumped around a resource? Are they uniform because of things like territoriality or sort of defense of that territory? Or are they random because the environment is homogeneous enough that there is no necessary difference? When you're trying to measure population sizes, there are a wide variety of tools that can be used. But the most common example is this N equals MC over R, which is the Mark recapture formula. This index says basically you have to go on two different visits. Okay, on visit one, you take a sample in an area and you mark them with some identifying characteristic. You come back after a certain amount of time and you catch another size of the similar population in the same area, and you divide by how many of those were marked from the first visit or recaptured. Okay, this does of course assume that your mark has no real impact on their survival and that you've given it long enough. So like a slow moving species, you would need to come back at a later amount of time. That's going to be part of that structure. But mark recapture is one of those ways that we can measure that. So all of these different components are going to be a measure of how you study a population and its changing nature, therefore population dynamics. Another factor is going to be like geographic distribution. Some things are going to be controlling where a population is or grows or develops. In this case on the right, if you remove the urchins, there is a massive increase in the survival of the seaweed. But if you only remove the limpets, it's not. So there's some sort of almost like a keystone relationship here. The sea urchins are much more impactful. When you're trying to look at a species and why it's not in an area, the first real question is it dispersal that is limiting it? Can they get there? Has there been enough time? Or is it accessible directly by the organism in the way that they travel? If that's not the limiter, then is it a biotic factor, some sort of predation, parasitism, competition, disease? If it's not a biotic factor, okay, is it an abiotic factor? Chemical or physical abiotic factors like pH or light. Okay, those things are going to be what controls dispersion and determines those relationships. All of these things are going to be interconnected and a major factor in how you study populations. When you start studying the vital statistics of a population, how they change over time, you're studying the demography. This is looking at birth rates and death rates. Okay, if you follow a cohort through their entire life cycle, determining the number alive at the beginning and the number that died during the year, and that gives you your life table, like the one on the left, and then you look at that as a graphic, as on the right, you end up with the survivorship curve. Type 1 survivorship curves are flat at the beginning because there's a low death rate in early and middle life, and then it drops steeply. Type 3 curves are the opposite. Okay, drop steeply in early stages and then long lasting. But then you end up with something like the ground squirrel. There's an equal chance of death every single time throughout their lifespan. That's a type 2 curve. These aren't absolutes, there are in-betweens and other sort of options, but this reproductive information can be very useful when you're trying to study a population, or say it's a human trying to do, like, I don't know, life insurance, okay, and other factors as well. So studying populations and change over time is demography. The two most basic population growth curves are ones that you're probably already familiar with. If you look at the change in the size of the population n over time, dn over dt, that is equal to Rn. Okay, R is going to be the rate, okay, and n is going to be the population size. So when you're trying to study these things, this Rn, this is the exponential growth. Okay, that means that you are growing from sort of this lagging beginning and then rapidly accelerating without limit. In real life situations, exponential growth is not really possible. Elephants in this example are growing exponentially because we're protecting them and not hunting them to death, so their numbers were way lower than they should have been. Okay, most organisms will eventually be limited by factors, both biotic and abiotic, in the ecosystem, and will instead exhibit this logistic regression, or sorry, there's logistic growth. Okay, there is a carrying capacity, K, that is limited the growth of the population. So by studying these things, we can have sort of understanding of how a population will change over time. And again, there aren't absolutes. There are going to be exceptions and differences. Like the Daphnia on the right, they go way above K, but then they get smacked back down because of limiting factors, like maybe nutrient availability or competition. Limited resources mandate trade-offs between investments in reproduction and survival. Okay, organisms have evolved different ways to control this structure, and we get the letters for this, the K and the R, from those formulas we just talked about. Okay, dandelions, for example, are going to release tons of offspring with very little energy investment by the parent, okay, whereas something like a Brazil nut is going to spend a lot of energy on that offspring. Okay, our selected species are those that emphasize high growth, typically exploiting less crowded niches, producing lots of offspring with relatively low care. In an unstable or unpredictable environment, our selection is going to be dominant. There is little advantage in adaptations that permit successful competition with other organisms because the environment is likely to change. Okay, K-selected organisms display traits associated with living at densities close to carrying capacity. They invest more heavily in fewer offspring, each of which has a relatively high probability of surviving to adulthood. And in stable or predictable environments, K selection is going to predominate, as the ability to compete successfully for limited resources is crucial. Traits that are thought to be characteristic of K would be things like a large body, a long life, production of few offspring. Some organisms are simply R or K, some are in between. This isn't an absolute, there's shades of gray in between, but it gives that sort of that nature there. It's about parental investment and number of offspring and offspring survival. Which one makes the most sense for your ecosystem? Factors that limit resources could be density dependent, where the number of organisms in the area are going to have an impact or going to affect it, okay? Or they could be density independent. They're going to have an effect regardless, okay? And within that, those effects could be biotic or they could be abiotic. All of that's going to come together into the different sort of combinations, okay? A birth rate or death rate that does not change with population density is density independent. Okay, a death rate that increases or a birth rate that falls as population density rises is density dependent. So there's going to be feedback loops and all those sort of structures there. But density dependent regulation is probably what we are thinking of with some of these things. Competition, predation, disease, all of these things are going to have a greater impact when population density is higher. Okay. Some density dependence things could be positive. They could be a facilitation. Positive density dependence is going to be when the population growth is facilitated by increased population density, and that's going to be less common. Negative density dependence is going to be basically a density dependence restriction. So something like when you're crowded, more disease spreads. That's going to have an impact. With unlimited resources and in the absence of predators, the population of a species can grow exponentially until it reaches carrying capacity. Predators limit prey by consuming them and by changing their behaviors. Increases or decreases in the prey can also lead to increases or decreases in the number of predators. Some populations undergo these regular cycles sort of back and forth as part of that. Okay. Is this the be-all, end-all of what's going on within a population? No, there's a lot more information that we don't have. Okay, why do the numbers rise and fall? Well, maybe there was a food shortage. Maybe there was something other factor confounding variables. We don't have the amount of producers, for example. That's going to be a major control factor. So predator-prey interactions can help explain some of that cyclic nature, but it's not the absolute. You will notice, however, that there is sort of a lag within these structures. The wolves peaked, and then a little later, the moose hit that low trough. Okay, back and forth, back and forth. That lag in time shows you an impact of reproduction rates and the survival of the predator and prey and how that connects to each other. When you start looking at populations, that's all well and good, but sometimes populations are actually part of a metapopulation. A metapopulation consists of a group of spatially separated populations of the same species which interact at some level. Most likely, they're going to be connected by gene flow, like immigration and emigration, like with a ring species, as we can see here. That's going to influence populations, particularly it's going to be sort of a balancing force. It's going to spread resources. It's going to spread genes. Okay, and sometimes those links can fail, which is going to lead to diversification and change. So although individual populations have finite lifespans, the metapopulation as a whole is often stable because immigrants from one population can recolonize habitats that have been left open due to the extinction of others. Okay, so the development of this metapopulation theory in conjunction with sort of the idea of source and sinks of resources, it sort of emphasizes the importance of connectivity between isolated populations. Although no single population may be able to guarantee the long-term survival of a given species, the combined effect of many populations may be able to do this. And that's one concern that they're having, like with humans, with sort of the one planet limitation. If something were to happen, would humanity exist? Okay, so spreading and developing that metapopulation is part of that concept.